The road stretched endlessly ahead, an empty ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dark, whispering trees that lined either side. The only sound was the hum of the car's engine and the occasional pop of a tire over an uneven patch in the road. It was supposed to be a peaceful road trip, 2 friends, a weekend getaway, nothing more than a short drive to the mountains. But the longer they travelled down this desolate highway, the more unsettled they felt. There was something off about this place, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. It was as if the road itself was pulling them in, tightening its grip around their sense of reality. "Why did we take this route again?" Claire asked, her voice trembling slightly as she glanced nervously out the window. "This feels wrong." "Because the GPS said it was a shortcut," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice calm, though his knuckles were white from gripping the wheel too tightly. "We'll be there in no time." The trees around them thickened, their branches reaching like arms trying to block out the sky. The headlights barely penetrated the gloom, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the road ahead. They'd passed the last gas station miles ago, and now there were no signs of life, no other cars, no houses, not even a distant light. Just the endless road and the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing at the clock. "It's been hours. Where the hell are we?" "Just a few more miles," Jake said, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. He didn't recognize any of this. The road seemed to have changed, the curve of the turns felt unfamiliar, the stretch of it longer than it should have been. "We must have missed the sign or something," he muttered, but he wasn't sure if he believed it. He kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following them. There had been no other cars since they left the last town, but somehow it felt like they were being watched. The radio crackled suddenly, the static filling the car like a living thing. Jake reached to turn it off, but before his hand could touch the dial, a distorted voice came through, low and urgent. "Turn back." "Ma." He froze, hand hovering in mid-air. Claire's breath hitched as she turned to look at him, her face pale. "What was that?" she whispered. I don't know." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He turned the radio dial, but the voice only grew louder. "Turn back. You're going the wrong way," it repeated, growing more frantic with each word. "Shut it off," Claire shouted, panic rising in her voice. Jake scrambled to turn the radio off, but as he did, the voice came through the speakers again, louder than before. "Turn back. You don't belong here. Turn back before it's too late." The car lurched, its tires screeching as the steering wheel jerked violently to the right, pulling them onto the shoulder. Jake's heart raced. He hadn't touched the wheel. "Did you feel that?" Claire gasped, her eyes wide with fear. Yeah, Jake's voice was tight, his grip on the wheel unsteady. He tried to correct the car, but it felt as though the road itself was trying to steer them off course, dragging them deeper into the woods. The trees on either side seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. Suddenly, the car's headlights illuminated something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. A person, unmoving, draped in what looked like a long, wet coat. The figure didn't seem to notice them, didn't react at all, just stood there like a mannequin, blocking their way. "Holy shit," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to stop." Jake slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet road. The figure didn't move. It didn't even flinch. They came to a halt just a few feet from it, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Jake's eyes locked on the figure, trying to make out any details, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the faint outline of the person's shape. "Should we? Should we get out?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe they need help." Jake shook his head. "No, let's just go around them." But before he could even think about shifting the car into reverse, the figure's head turned, slowly, unnaturally. The movement was so deliberate it was like the person was a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The face that finally came into view was pale, too pale, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into their souls. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, just a ragged breath that filled the space between them. And then, without warning, the figure stepped forward, its limbs jerking stiffly like something not quite human. "Go," Claire screamed, her voice breaking as the figure lurched toward them, one step, then two. Jake didn't need any more encouragement. He threw the car into reverse and floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning in place before they shot backward down the road. Claire twisted in her seat, staring out the rear window, her eyes wide with terror. But when she looked back at Jake, she froze. There, behind them, in the distance, was something else, a flickering light, like the glow of a lantern, moving steadily toward them. It wasn't the figure from the road, it was something far worse. It was a shape, or a thing, moving with jerky, erratic motions, like it was being dragged along the road. "Keep going," Claire screamed, her voice frantic. "Faster, Jake." But no matter how fast he drove, it felt like the road was stretching further ahead, pulling them deeper into the woods. The light followed them, gaining on them, and with it came the sound of something else scraping, dragging, like nails on stone. The smell of decay filled the car, thick and nauseating, as though the very air was alive with death. "I don't know what's happening," Jake gasped, sweat beading on his forehead. "This doesn't make sense. Where the hell is the exit?" And then, out of nowhere, a flash of light, blinding, searing, as though the sun itself had suddenly exploded in front of them. Jake slammed on the brakes, but the car kept moving forward, the wheels sliding uncontrollably. The entire world seemed to tilt and twist, and suddenly, everything went dark. When Jake opened his eyes again, the car had stopped, the engine still running, but they were no longer on the road. The trees had disappeared, replaced by a thick, black fog that swallowed everything around them. Claire was gone. She wasn't in the car, wasn't anywhere to be seen. A voice echoed from the depths of the fog, low, mocking, and eerily familiar. "You should have turned back." Jake's breath hitched in his chest as the darkness pressed in, the road now nothing more than a memory. And somewhere, far behind him, something was waiting. Something that wasn't done with them yet. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he strained against the suffocating silence. The car sat motionless, still running, the engine's hum the only sound in the oppressive stillness. His hand trembled as he reached for the door handle, but he hesitated, the weight of the fog pressing in around him like an invisible hand. The world outside had transformed completely where the trees and the road had been just moments ago. There was now nothing but dense, swirling black mist that seemed to eat up the light, as though the very air had turned to ink. "Claire," he called out hoarsely, his voice sounding too loud, too fragile in the eerie quiet. There was no answer. His pulse quickened, panic bubbling in his throat. "Claire." He threw open the door and stepped out onto the cold ground, the mist immediately swallowing him up. The air was thick and wet, and the stench of decay lingered heavily, clinging to his skin and nostrils. He felt disoriented, as if the world had shifted, had twisted somehow while he wasn't looking. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, soft, like he was walking on some kind of damp, rotting earth. He turned in a slow circle, desperate to catch a glimpse of anything familiar, but it was as though he had stepped into another world altogether, one that had no rules, no reason. "Claire, where are you?" His voice cracked with the force of his fear. A sudden rustling behind him made him spin around, his heart leaping into his throat. The mist parted momentarily, and for a split second, he thought he saw someone moving through the fog. He ran toward the shape, calling out again, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. His breath came faster, and his chest tightened. He should have never taken this shortcut, never ignored his gut when it told him to turn back. A soft, whispering sound reached his ears, barely audible above the hum of his racing heart. It was like voices, like one voice, repeating something over and over, but distorted, as if it were coming from deep underground. "Turn back. Turn back. You should have turned back." Jake's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his growing terror. He knew that voice. He recognized it. It was the same one from the radio, from the moment they'd first heard that chilling warning. But now it was here, in the fog, closing in on him, growing louder and more distorted by the second. He stumbled back to the car, yanking the door open and sliding inside, the air around him thick with the suffocating stench of decay. The car still sat there, engine running, but the dashboard lights flickered erratically, casting long, unnatural shadows on the seats. He grabbed the steering wheel, his hands slick with sweat, and slammed his foot down on the gas. The car jerked forward, tires spinning on the wet, slick ground, but the road ahead didn't change. The mist didn't recede. It only thickened, pulling him deeper into its clutches. "Where am I going?" Jake muttered, his voice strained. The road wasn't even a road anymore, it was nothing more than a path of shifting fog, as though the world itself had erased the path they had travelled and replaced it with a new, ever-shifting labyrinth. A flash of movement caught his eye in the rearview mirror, and his stomach dropped. There was someone behind him. "Claire?" He spun in his seat, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the dense fog swirling around him. But as he turned his head back toward the road, he saw the shadow of a figure, crouched low to the ground, moving impossibly fast across the mist-filled highway. It was crawling. At first, Jake thought it was a trick of the fog. A shadow. But then it became clear it wasn't just a shadow. It was something else. The figure's limbs were twisted unnaturally long, its body crawling across the road like an insect. The way it moved too fast, too fluid, made Jake's stomach churn. The thing's face was obscured by the fog, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about its silhouette, its posture. It moved toward him with the same jerky, puppet-like motions he had seen earlier from the thing on the road. Jake slammed on the brakes, but the car skidded, tires screeching as the mist thickened even more, making it nearly impossible to see anything beyond a few feet in front of him. The figure moved closer, its limbs reaching out, and that's when Jake finally saw its face, pale, gaunt, with eyes that were completely empty. Hollow, as though there were no life left inside. His breath caught in his throat as the thing's mouth opened, wide, far too wide, stretching unnaturally as it whispered a single word. "Turn." A sound, like the cracking of bones, echoed from behind him, as the thing lunged forward, its fingers clawing at the back of the car. Jake yanked the wheel hard to the right, but the car didn't respond. It felt like it was stuck, as if the road itself was holding him captive. The shadow was closer now, just inches away, and its breath ragged and wet pressed against the glass. The thing's smile twisted wider, impossibly wide, as if it were made of jagged, broken teeth. "Turn back." The voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a growl that shook the car, rattling the windows, as though the very air around him was being torn apart. In a blind panic, Jake shoved the car into reverse, pressing the gas pedal with all his might. The car lurched back, but it wasn't fast enough. He glanced in the rearview mirror just as the figure's hand reached the back window, fingers scraping at the glass. The car began to slide backward, faster now, but the fog didn't dissipate. It thickened. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Jake saw it another figure. And another. Figures, all moving in unison, crawling toward him from the dense fog, their faces hidden in shadow, their hands outstretched as though they were waiting for something, waiting for him. His heart hammered in his chest as he fought the wheel, pulling the car further back, trying to escape, but the fog seemed to close in tighter with every passing second, trapping him in a tightening noose. Then, through the swirling mist, a light flickered on the horizon. It was dim, distant, but it was a light. Without a second thought, Jake yanked the wheel and aimed the car toward the light, praying that somehow it was an escape. But as the car sped toward it, the mist began to fade, thinning out only to reveal something far worse. The road. The road they had been driving on, the one that had stretched endlessly into the unknown, was gone. Instead, there was nothing but an endless void and abyss, stretching out in front of them, darker than the fog. The light ahead wasn't an exit. It was a trap. The ground beneath the car began to crumble, and Jake's stomach lurched as the world around him started to distort, folding in on itself. The figures behind him were gone, but their presence lingered, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. He slammed the brakes again, but it was too late. The car lurched forward into the abyss, and everything went black. The car tumbled through the void, weightless, suspended in a dark, endless space. The once familiar hum of the engine had died out, replaced by the suffocating silence that surrounded Jake like a physical pressure, squeezing the air from his lungs. He could no longer tell up from down, and the darkness so complete, so absolute, seemed to stretch on forever. He reached for the steering wheel, but it was gone, the car no longer even a tangible thing beneath him. The sense of falling intensified, a sensation that gnawed at his sanity, as if he was plunging into some infinite chasm where time and reality had no meaning. Suddenly, a light flickering, distant, but undeniable pierced the abyss. It was pale, like the weak glow of a dying star, but it was something. He reached toward it instinctively, as though it might pull him out of this nightmare. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. His throat was dry, constricted, as though something was smothering him from the inside. His body refused to move, frozen in place as the light grew closer, almost mockingly slow, as if teasing him. The light expanded and shifted, and with it, shapes began to take form. Not figures, not people shapes. They were like shadows, but not of anything earthly, abstract, twisted, unreal. Eyes, hollow and vast, opened in the darkness. Mouths stretched open, wider than natural, their edges jagged, like cracked porcelain. They were not looking at him, they were looking through him. Every sense screamed at him to look away, to shut his eyes, to run, but his body refused to obey. A voice, no, a chorus of voices rippled through the space, and with it, a feeling of recognition. The voices sounded like those of the figures from before, but somehow they were different now, clearer. They were no longer growling or whispering. They were speaking, their words an unnatural, discordant symphony that reverberated in Jake's bones. "You should have turned back." The words slammed into him, crashing through his skull, splitting him open from the inside. His chest ached, as if the weight of the world or whatever this was pressing down on him, trying to crush him into the nothingness. And then, as if they had all been waiting for this moment, the shapes converged. The edges of their forms blurred, rippling like water disturbed by a stone, and they moved together, as one. The dark mouths stretched wider still, pulling apart, revealing the blackness within. Jake's mind snapped. He tried to scream, but the words caught in his throat. Where was Claire? Where had she gone? He had to find her. He couldn't leave her behind. He had to. And just as his thoughts began to spiral, the shapes around him shifted again. Claire's face. A flash of her, just her face, appeared in the void before him, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. She was there, but not there. A reflection. A mockery. A vision of something that once was. But then the fog started to shift around her. Her face twisted, morphing into something else, no, into someone else. It was all wrong. Her skin began to rot away, leaving only the hollowed-out remnants of what had once been human. Jake, her voice was muffled, distant, barely audible. You should... The faces around him, the shapes moved again, surrounding the vision of Claire's decaying face, swallowing it whole. And in that instant, Jake realized with a sickening certainty this wasn't a place for escape. He was never meant to leave. The light flickered, expanding rapidly, pulling him closer, pulling him in. And as the light engulfed him, everything went dark. Completely, utterly dark. There was no sound, no movement, no escape, no place anymore. And then, Jake was nothing.